Good afternoon and welcome everyone. So excited to be here. Thank you for coming to our panel discussion, Puerto Rican and Cuban Roots in Latin Jazz. So very exciting to be here. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel, but you can scan the program and have their full bios there. So starting with Mr. Fran Vielma, educator, percussionist, band leader. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks.
Mr. Chris Washburn, educator, trombonist, author. Thank you for being here tonight. Mr. Roberto Fonseca, pianist, composer, band leader. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
And Mr. William Cepeda from Puerto Rico, trombonist, composer, and band leader.
Thank you.
So before we get started, I want to let you know that in your seats, you have a piece of paper and a pencil, and that's for you to write your questions. We're going to do 45 minutes and then 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you have questions, please write them down, and then at the end, my colleague Jay will collect those, and I will read them from the microphone. So let's get started. I feel like we can't really talk about the roots without going back into history. So I have a question for our panelists. If we want to know when Latin jazz started, some people think that it started about 1947 with Mario Bauza and Machito in New York City. And some people think that it began pretty much behind that time in the early 1900s or even 1700s. So that's a question for the panel. I would like to start with Chris. What do you think, Chris?
Well, it's a fascinating question because in the popular press, people typically look at the moment that Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo, the trumpet player and the conga player, started to collaborate, and they did a tour. And that they oftentimes, if you look at even in recent publications of when the birth of Latin jazz happened, it happened at the moment when Dizzy brought Chano Pozo onto the stage of Carnegie Hall, and they did a collaboration playing a variety of different music that they wrote together. And after that concert, the press came up and asked Dizzy, what's the name of the type of music that you play? And he said, well, he thought a minute, and he said, we play cubop, which of course was Cuba and bebop put together. And it was a savvy marketing strategy because, of course, he was on the forefront of the bebop revolution, and he kind of started the naming game in the jazz genre. And it was the best moment in this music's history, and it was probably one of the worst because it was the moment where the music became separated. If you're more familiar with earlier jazz styles, there was an event that happened in 1930 when the Don Aspiazo in his Havana Casino Orchestra performed in Midtown, meaning for white people, playing kind of what they were billing as traditional Cuban music. And it led to a subsequent recording on RCA Victor that launched the rumba dance craze. And rumba was not the music that they played, but the RCA Victor record executives didn't speak Spanish, and they didn't even care enough to ask what the music was called. It was actually son and son pregones that they were recording. And people turned to that as a moment where it was the first Cuban dance craze that kind of hits the United States and goes international. And so many people think, well, that's when Latin jazz started. But of course, Latin jazz wasn't a term that was used only in the 1960s. So before that, they would just call it rumba, and many jazz bands played it, and as well as the rumba bands and son bands from Cuba. But then in 1938, something really special happened. Jelly Roll Morton was being interviewed, in the great pianist from New Orleans, and he said, you know, early jazz, in order for it to have the right flavor, it needs a Spanish tinge. And then what he's referring to was the early Caribbean influence to New Orleans music. And in my most recent book, Latin Jazz, The Other Jazz, I decided to explore what that really meant and what is the Latin tinge. And you can listen to early Jelly Roll Morton and you could hear a variety of different rhythms that are very prominent throughout the Caribbean and also very prominent in Afro-Cuban music, such as the clave rhythm or the tresillo or the cinquillo rhythms, 3-beat rhythms and 5-beat rhythms.
Of course, you got to have these little tinges of Spanish in it. in order to play real good jazz. Jazz has a foundation that must be very prominent, especially with the bass sections, in order to give a great background, plus what's called riffs today, which was known as figures, but figures hasn't always been in the dance bands. I'll give you an idea what the idea of Spanish there is in the blues. This particular tune, I wouldn't be honest if I said that maybe the whole tune belonged to me, although my name is on it. It's supposed to be arranged by Mr. Joe Jordan, but these arrangements were made also by myself. There's a man that used to teach me to play piano. I'll have to give him credit for some contribution to this tune. His name was Frank Richards. He was older than I was. He was on the ragtime order, but he was a very good player as far as it went. Although he was incapable of instructing anybody along music that is, for very short ways, that's all he could go. He couldn't go very far because he didn't know so very much about music himself. But at least in the early days, in my beginning on piano, he was the first one that started my instructions, and I thank him greatly for that. His name is Frank Richards. I mentioned it before, but I want to be sure that you get his name correctly. Frank Richards.
What part of the blues did he contribute?
Well, I claim that his contribution was more in the perfection way. The melodies were all mine, but I believe that he could do much better than I could with it, because he made a lot of corrections that probably would have gone maybe haywire. And of course I've kept the tune ever since. It's one of my first tunes. As I before said, maybe you may be able to notice the Spanish tinge, but you must have a powerful background. For instance, those days they used La Paloma, was one of the great Spanish tunes. You know, New Orleans was inhabited with maybe every race on the face of the globe. And of course we had Spanish people, there are plenty of them, and plenty of French people. Of course I may demonstrate a little bit of La Paloma to show you that the tinge is really in there.
Take it easy.
The common time, which will give you the same thing in the... I hope this is quite clear to you. See, only one is the blues. The differentiating in these things, it comes from the right hand. You play the left hand just the same, but of course blues, you get the syncopation in there. It gives it an entirely different color. It really changes the color from red to blue. Powerful bass hand.
But why was that music actually, or why were those sounds being played in early New Orleans? Because New Orleans is usually viewed as the kind of center node for the emergence of jazz. And when we look deeply into that history, and if anybody's been to New Orleans, you realize that people in New Orleans, their food tastes different, their architecture is different, their music is different, the culture is different. Why? Because New Orleans was the northernmost Caribbean city for many, many years, ruled by the Spanish and then the French off and on. And that inflected it in a very different way. But more importantly, it was the center node for West African culture coming into this country during the times of slavery.
The roots of Afro-Cuban music, whether it be charanga, Latin big band, small band, which we call conjunto, is all from Africa. Everything we trace back to Africa.
This richness of music that is centuries old has traveled within the African diaspora to the New World, meaning the Great Antilles, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Haiti and Santo Domingo.
The rhythm patterns of these people comes from the Yoruba tribe, which were the most sophisticated drummers in Africa.
There's something majestic about the drum, and very visceral.
Always been called savage music. It's not savage at all. Probably one of the more sophisticated musics on the planet.
The Spanish conquistadors, they sort of turned their face, turned the other way to the music of the slaves. Well, let them have their music, let them have their dancing, let them enjoy themselves a little bit. Much different from the slave owner in the U.S., who was such a control freak. They took the drum, they took their names, they took everything.
They never allowed their drum here. By not allowing the drum, they lost Africanism. And little by little, from working eventually the plantations and all that, what you came out of there was the blues, the classic blues. But the Caribbean is different because the black African captive is allowed his drum.
The drum is part of the language. So I think because of the drum, blacks in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Haiti, and Santo Domingo were able to retain some of the language and some of the customs.
If you didn't have a drum, you wouldn't have music.
The drum, which is what imitates the pulse of life, is the essence of our music.
The West African rhythms took root in one Caribbean island above all others.
The mambo is Cuban. The cha-cha-cha is Cuban. The danzón is Cuban. The guaracha is Cuban. The son is Cuban. The son montuno is Cuban. The guajira is Cuban. You can't find another country that's given us as many things as Cuba has given us.
I'm a little Congo. Before the Louisiana Purchase by the Americans, the French allowed the plantation slaves 1 day a week, usually on Sundays, to assemble at a location known as the Congo Square for such activities as drumming and dancing. Between 1750 and 1800s, there was no documented music activities of the Africans in Louisiana. But later in the 19th century, musicians such as Buddy Bolden and Scott Joplin began to emerge, adapting the musical culture brought by their forebearers to the Americas. The rhythmic practices they applied were plantation songs that later became ragtime and jazz. It was called Congo Square, named after one of the ethnic groups brought as slaves to work in the plantations. Today, the Congo Square is regarded as the birthplace of jazz.
Indeed, it was the first kind of major trading station for those enslaved peoples in the United States, and it was started by the French. And the earliest enslaved peoples were brought in 1716 and 1717, and they were from the island of Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, and Martinique.
Who's ever been to a second line before? Who's ever heard jazz music before? Well, let me tell you what influenced the second line, where those traditions came from. They came from a place that is called Congo Square. Congo Square is located in New Orleans, directly behind the St. Louis Cathedral. There are 6 blocks to Congo Square. And lots of things happened there over the years, from the very beginning of the city until now, that influence our culture, that make our culture, that's at the root of our culture. And let's talk about some of those things. New Orleans was founded by the French in 1718, and the first enslaved people were brought en masse in 1719, within a year. We know that in the Code Noir, one of the provisions was that enslaved people had Sundays as a day of rest. People gathered in circles, and inside those circles were musicians as well as dancers. There was the opportunity for them to continue their practices that they knew from their homelands. And this was how they celebrated, how they were able to remember. After 1808, the domestic slave trade became very, very active. People had been brought from different locations, from Virginia, from Maryland, from Washington, D.C., from North Carolina. People had been exposed to all kinds of cultures, like German culture to Italian culture. There were a large number of people who were of Haitian descent. And we know that all of those came together in Congo Square. It's almost like a melting pot, almost like a diaspora within itself. And over time, those influences, those musical practices merged and blended to indigenous practices. That means new musical forms. So after a while, we cannot say that it was African music. We cannot say that it was European music. We have to say it was something else, right? And that something else eventually became what we call jazz. They made instruments that modeled after the ones they knew in their homelands and played the music that they knew in their homelands. They used rhythmic patterns that they knew in their homelands. But they also played the music and music instruments that they found in the places where they lived and encountered. So I'd like to show you some of the instruments that were played in Congo Square. And we know this from different sources, primary documents, accounts, newspaper articles, interviews from the WPA period. This is a jawbone of a mule's jawbone, and I heard about it, I read about this rather, in several accounts. And this makes such an awesome sound. You can't duplicate this. In Africa, the gourd is used for so many purposes. And it's used as a jug, if you cut this off and you get the seeds out, but it's also used as a sound chamber. So this instrument, which people call the kalimba or the mbira, you can hear it if you're very close to it. But if you place it into the gourd, the sound amplifies, magnifies it, rattles. And the rattles were very important in the music that was played at Congo Square. So, of course, you take them, and they were made different ways. This is another example of instruments that were used in Congo Square. So we have the reed made from bamboo. So the primary instrument was the drum. It laid the foundation for the music. And there were different sizes, different shapes, different styles of drums. So today, Congo Square is known around the world for the legacy of the enslaved Africans, their gatherings, their music, and their dance that they perpetuated there. And on Sunday afternoons, people of all ethnic backgrounds gather to drum and to dance and to express themselves. Come and visit Congo Square because it's a great place to learn about the history of the city and the contributions that enslaved Africans as well as free people of color, but just the African presence in general made to the cultural landscape of New Orleans. And that landscape influenced the country as well as the world.
And that was the first documented moment where Caribbean culture was infused into the United States or the pre-United States. And that's what inflected that culture. They brought in 3,500 people. There were only about 2,000 people living in New Orleans at the time, so it basically doubled the population of what is now known as Louisiana. And it is at that point where we can trace the roots of these rhythms in jazz. So the fundamental question of asking what are the Puerto Rican and Cuban roots of Latin jazz, maybe we should be asking what are the Cuban and Puerto Rican roots of jazz, because in my definition, the birth of Latin jazz was in 1716, before anything that's even conceived of jazz was there. And so it's so fundamental to the foundations of jazz that every jazz band ever since has been playing this music and Caribbean influenced music.
And we were talking a few minutes ago with William about also the importance, taking us back to New York City, the importance of the Puerto Rican community in making Latin jazz live during the time of the music embargo. That we didn't have any music coming from Cuba, but we had the Puerto Rican community who consumed Latin jazz, who played the beats, who played the songs, and that continued the tradition in New York City.
Yes, 1900, Puerto Ricans are being USA citizens, so they start to migrate into New York in 1900. So, and once they got there, they start collaborating, performing with other jazz musicians. And I think that they was bringing their flavor to the jazz, because doesn't matter, we always bring who we are to the music. So if I collaborate with anyone else, I always gonna bring my roots to the music of the person that I'm collaborating with. And we just basically sharing the two type of music and make it kind of like a different taste of the music, a different flavor. And I believe that that was happening as the Puerto Rican was living in New York and collaborating with all these jazz musicians in New York. also, I know that we didn't, at the beginning, when the Latin jazz started to get firm, we wasn't using our roots. To collaborate, but we was part of it, part of the scene, part of the, when that happened, we were supporting the music, we were performing that music for many, many decades. So, and keep it alive also, because, you know, other people from the Caribbean have a little situation to immigrate to the United States. So I believe that Puerto Rican had to do a lot with it. I mean, I can mention some Puerto Rican, like Rafael Hernandez, one of the best composers from Puerto Rico. You know, he was born in 1991. I played with this band from the how you call it, from the Harlem Hellfires. You know, and they was with Jane Reed, Europa was the leader, and they traveled all over Europe playing jazz. You know, one of the first time that the jazz was going around Europe. So we got him. He was one of the best composers from Puerto Rico. He composed tunes like Preciosa, El Cumbanchero. All those tunes are still part of the songbook of Latin America music. Yeah. So, and he was also one of the first person that played and performed and record jazz. You know, as a musician, he also was like a guitar player. He played euphonium, so he was an instrumentalist also. I think that part was before all those, you know, when Dizzy Gillespie got together with Chano Pozo and stuff like that. You know, we also have somebody else from Puerto Rico, Juan Tizol. He played with Duke Ellington big band, and he composed one of the most recorded tunes of the whole time, Caravan.
Look here, children. Now how come? This here barbecue looks so glum. Speak up, sister. You ain't dumb.
How come?
How come? How come?
How come?
We were dancing for the cup, but the band done stood us up.
No jive and no jumping? Well, I guess this calls for something.
those kind of, at the beginning, those kind of collaborations, I think that was giving a little firm to the Latin jazz before, actually was Cuban or was what, but also other people from the Caribbean also. We can talk about St. Thomas, Sonny Rollins. That's kind of like a calypso to it, Caribbean. So, the Latin jazz have a lot of roots to it.